So before we get started, we all know that there's water under the ground. We have proven that. We get it. We also know that water under the ground is safe to drink as opposed to surface water, which can be contaminated. And we also know that we dig wells to get to that water. That's why the whole purpose of a well. The point of this presentation is, but what if we didn't even have to dig a well to get to that water? What you're going to do is you're going to follow along and answer these questions as you go through the presentation. But I want to point out to you that you have this section here that you will have to answer at the conclusion. You must list 5 questions, facts, things you found interesting, anything that was not specifically an answer to those questions. So you can't just go through this and eyeball the answers to the questions. You must listen, pay attention, and then you got to prove to me basically that you did. This is due at the end of the class period. This will be collected at the end of the class period regardless of where you're at in the presentation. I will return this to you tomorrow for use on the notes check.
So what we have here is water coming up out of the ground. This is groundwater that is coming to the surface on its own, and you can see it flowing directly out of the ground there. Well, this is a natural occurrence. This is called a spring. A spring is where water comes up from the ground naturally. And springs are historically very, very important because the water was so clean. There is no animal living underground. There's no pollution deep underground, at least historically speaking. So the water that comes up out of the ground from a spring is clean water, which means you can drink it directly. You don't have to treat it. You don't have to worry about it making you sick and poisoning you. And you can kind of see that here about how clear this water is. It's not cloudy. There's nothing in it that's going to cause you any harm. Well, this particular natural spring is in Gainesville, Florida, and what they did was they built a collection supply, and then they built this waterworks, and they sent the spring water directly to town, because if you catch that water right there where it's coming out of the ground, it's clean and you can drink it. Now once it sits on the surface, you can see it is not safe to drink anymore. That's why the pipe there is going under the ground. So a spring is a place where water comes up out of the ground naturally, and historically they were very important because it gave you a source of clean, reliably safe drinking water, and everybody needs good clean water. This is much better than getting your water from a river where you don't know what's in the water. So once again, a spring is a place where water comes up out of the ground naturally.
Now, how do springs form? Well, first of all, remember, springs are groundwater, so water's got to get into the ground. And we know that when water falls and hits the ground, it goes through the ground and will wind up underground. But not all the ground is the same. We've got this layer here, which is a different type of rock. Maybe that's a layer of rock that is not very permeable. So the water comes down and then it kind of gets hung up here. So we wind up with an area where we have a collection of water underground. That's the first part. Well, the ground's not always level. So let's say water comes and it hits this impermeable layer and that kind of slides down here. Well, and it collects right here. Well, as more water slides down, it pushes it up out of the ground, and that's how a natural spring is formed. You see this here, Death Valley, a place where it doesn't rain hardly at all, but you'll get some snow and some rain over here in the mountains, and it seeps into the ground and it pops up over here at this low point. That's a spring. Now, how big are these springs? Well, they can be really small. They can basically just be a small trickle coming out of the rock. They can also be the size of a pond or a lake. Out here in the middle, that's where the water is coming up out of the ground. It's coming up out of the ground and then it spreads out and makes this small pond. Now, springs are not rare. They're found in all 50 states because it rains in all 50 states, even in the desert. They can form any place where there's a spot that water can wiggle its way to the surface. We know water's down there, but if it can find a spot to the surface, you can have a spring. Why were these things so traditionally valued? Because the water was clean. We know groundwater is good water. It won't make you sick. So instead of having to dig a well, if you can just have the water coming to you on its own, that is huge. In Lithia Springs, Florida, the town, they actually still get their drinking water from the spring. As opposed to here in Roswell, where we take water out of the Chattahoochee River and we treat it and run it through a pipe to our house, they just run a pipe straight down into the springs, and you can see it right there. Now you might ask yourself, wait a minute, they're drinking this water. Aren't there people standing over here and this people are swimming around? There might be some fish in there. Yeah, but let me show you how they catch the water before it gets to the point where it can be contaminated. So here's the spring, and I'm swimming in it. And this is the spring that the houses in that area get their water from. If you look down the bottom, there's basically a cave, a hole in the bottom, and you see there's a grate, there's a gate over there, and down there you can see there's a pipe. And the pipe down there is where they catch the spring water and they take it out of the spring and they run it to people's houses while it's still clean. The first spring I showed you, the one with the definition of spring, that's in Gainesville, Florida. The University of Florida is located in Gainesville, and it is located in Gainesville specifically because they had this spring. In 1905, they were looking for a place to make the University of Florida. And the town of Gainesville said, hey, come here. We've got this big natural spring, and we've got a pumping station. We'll send you all the clean water that you need to run a university, to flush every toilet, for water to drink, for water to cook with, and to bathe in. So the University of Florida is in Gainesville because of this spring that was located there. Now, they don't use this spring for the drinking water anymore, because the city of Gainesville has gotten much bigger than the amount of water that this spring could provide. And now we have modern plumbing. We can treat surface water a lot more effectively. But historically, these springs were very important because they gave you a source of clean drinking water, which everybody needed. Now, the state of Florida by far has more springs than any other place on the earth. Over 700 big springs. Well, the question is why? There are three reasons. And the first reason is real simple. What do we know about this part of the country? It rains a lot. You got to have precipitation that will go into the ground to make a spring. So the more precipitation you have, the more likely you are to have a spring. And that's the first big reason. And we remember from fall semester why this is, because we get those nice sea breezes that come in off the ocean. Well, then it gets rising hot air over the land, takes the water up, makes clouds, and it rains. It rains a lot in Florida. The second reason, the ground here in Florida is very flat. And what this does is this allows water to just kind of sit there, and it gives it time to go into the ground. So you get a lot more infiltration in places where the ground is flat, and that just makes sense. Think about this right here. If it rains on the mountaintop, the water is going to slide down the mountaintop before it has a chance to go into the ground. But over here, this is like Florida. The ground is very flat, so the water doesn't go anywhere except straight into the ground. The third reason is the soil in Florida is made up primarily of sand. And we saw from our lab activity that water will go into sand very easily. So it rains a lot, it's flat, and the ground is sandy. All three of those combine to give Florida the perfect combination of factors to have a lot of springs. Let's look at some examples. And they're all over the place in Florida. Here's Juniper Springs. Notice the nice clear water. Because the water is coming up out of the ground, it doesn't bring a lot of dirt, or certainly not a lot of biological leaves and stuff like that with it. Spring water tends to be pretty clear. Here is Ponce de Leon Springs, which is a first magnitude, meaning a large spring in central Florida near Orlando. And you can see they've turned this into a recreation area. It's like a big natural swimming pool. It has the name Ponce de Leon Spring. Ponce de Leon was a Spanish conquistador and explorer who came to Florida, and he was looking for the fountain of youth, this magical water source that if you drank it or you bathed in it, it would help to keep you young for eternity. Now, he never found it, but this was one of the springs that he discovered that now kind of bears his name, that he thought might have been the mystical fountain of youth. Here's Rainbow Springs State Park, and you can see once again over here is a nice clear area. The water's coming up out of the ground. Well, it collects and it keeps coming up, so then the water kind of runs down this little river or stream. A lot of rivers and streams actually start at a spring where the water comes up out of the ground. Here is Ponce Springs. Once again, you can see there's the hole in the ground where the water is coming up from underneath from the groundwater. Now, these springs were huge tourist attractions in Florida, especially before the days of Disney. Before Disney, people still went to Florida on vacation because the weather was nice and you had beaches, but these springs were another huge attraction. One of the earliest ones was Silver Springs in Florida, and you can see it's a really large spring. These are boats that carry like 20 people, and you can get a sense of the size over here. Huge natural spring with clean, clear water that has a constant temperature to it. So in the days before you had really modern plumbing to make really big public swimming pools, back in the day, not every hotel had a swimming pool, not every apartment, not every neighborhood had a swimming pool. So these were natural swimming pools that you could go to, and they're found all over the place in Florida. So people would come to Florida and swim in the springs. You didn't have water parks, but you'd put up diving boards and slides and those sort of attractions in the natural springs. Wikileaks is another famous one in Florida, and that's another first magnitude spring. You can see it over here. It's a huge, it's 50 or 100 feet deep. It's a big hole in the ground, incredible amounts of water coming up out of it. And what they did was they built a theater over here, which was half underground, and you could look through the windows into the spring. Water's exceptionally clear. They started having these swimming and diving shows that kind of morphed into a mermaid show where they had girls dressed in little mermaid outfits, kind of dancing around and swimming around doing a choreographed show to the music that was piped into the theater. Now, after Disney came to town, after the advent of modern plumbing and big man-made water parks, these springs aren't as popular as they once were, but some of them, like Wikileaks, are still there today. You can still go and visit them, ride the water rides, and see the mermaid show. In Homosassa Springs and a lot of other springs actually in Florida, you can actually swim with the manatees. Manatees spend their summers in the Gulf of Mexico when the water is exceptionally warm. Well, the Gulf of Mexico starts to get a little cooler. They decide that they want a little bit warmer water, so they swim back up the rivers and they hang out in the springs because the springs stay the same temperature year-round because the water's coming up out of the ground. It's not affected by the sunlight. So it doesn't get hot and cold with summer and winter, and the manatees like the more moderate temperature of the springs in the wintertime. And you can go there and you can just swim with them. Here's Devil's Den. Now this is a kind of a neat case because it has this hole in the roof up here, and that's where the water used to come up out of the ground and onto the surface. Well, over time the water table has gone down a little bit in this particular part of Florida, so now the water table is down here. Well, it's still left this big open area, this big tank underground, so you can climb down in the cave and you can go swimming or scuba diving in the cave that's part of the natural spring. In Austin, Texas, it's not just Florida that has lots of natural springs. In Austin, Texas, they have Barton Springs. It's a huge swimming pool, and it's kind of looks man-made, but what's happening is out there in the middle you have springs that are popping water up out of the ground that fill the swimming pool. And in the days before you had chlorinated water filtration systems to make a swimming pool, you just walled off these natural springs and it's like a natural swimming pool, and it's still there today. It's a basically free natural swimming hole. So why would they be turned into tourist attractions? Basically, it's a free natural swimming pool with all the clean water you want. You don't have to use any chlorine. You don't have to treat it. You don't have to clean it because clean water keeps coming up out of the ground. Another thing about these springs is that the temperature is constant. So you can swim in them in the wintertime. The water doesn't get cold or colder in the wintertime because it's not affected by the sunlight. So you can swim in a natural spring at any time of the year. Now, Georgia to Florida. Let's look at how Georgia is different. This is a scene here in Georgia. When it rains here in Georgia, our water hits the slope because our ground is not flat and the water tends to run off and go downhill. That's different than Florida, where the land is flat and the water just sits on the surface and tends to go into the soil easier. Another big difference with Georgia is we have clay. So when water hits clay, it doesn't go into it as easy. It's not nearly as permeable, so water will run off. So Georgia doesn't have nearly as many springs as Florida for two main reasons. One, the land is hillier and water runs off more. Two, the ground is filled with clay, which doesn't allow water to go into the ground. And if water can't get into the ground, it can't make a spring where it pops back up out of the ground. Now, we do have springs in Georgia. We have a couple of towns that have the names of spring right in there. You might recognize some of these. There are about 208 named springs in Georgia, or ones that were big enough that people said, hey, this is significant. I'm going to give this thing a name. The town of McDonough and a lot of other towns were actually founded and built up around springs. In 1823, as settlers were moving away from the coast in Georgia, they came across where McDonough is, and that's a town just south of Atlanta. They got to this spot and there was this big spring, natural water coming up out of the ground, which they needed clean water to drink. And they said, you know what, this would be a good place to live. Let's make our town right here where we've got this good natural water supply. And hence the town of McDonough sprouted up right there in that spot. And there are many, 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 many towns that are where they are because there was a spring there.
So let's talk about a very notable spring in our area, and one that I'm sure you will recognize the name of. Back here, underneath this little grating here, there is water coming up out of the ground naturally. That's a spring. This particular one is called Sandy Spring. Hence the name of the town in our area, North Fulton, called Sandy Springs. People moved to this area and they settled here because they had this spring coming up out of the ground in some nice sandier soil, which made the water not as muddy, so a little bit easier to drink. Well, think about the area of Sandy Springs. This area, people came here and they lived here because they had this nice, good, clean, reliable source of drinking water. They had the sandy spring, which gave them good water. Now, we're going to go over here and take a look at it, and the spring isn't so impressive anymore. So here is the Sandy Spring, from which the town of Sandy Springs got its name. And people came here and settled in this area because they had this spring here, which was a good, reliable source of clean water. Now, it doesn't look like much, and it isn't now. The question is, what has changed with this spring? Remember, a spring is where water comes up out of the ground naturally. How did water get into the ground in the first place? Well, it had to infiltrate from rain, precipitation. It doesn't rain any less now than it did 200 years ago. But what's different about this area is now that it's all parking lots and roads and buildings and houses. And that means there's so little area for water to get into the ground that it means there's so much less water to then come out of the ground. So springs can run dry. They can actually even die if their water supply is cut down. Now consider where I'm at now. I'm standing at North Springs High School, which if you've heard of this high school, you know where it's at. It's in the town of Sandy Springs, very close to where we are in Roswell. But let's stop and talk about, well, why is this high school called North Springs? It's because there used to be a spring in this area, and it is a little bit north of the Sandy Springs. So this area was called North Springs because there was a spring here of note. Now, that spring is long since dried up and gone. It's been covered up by roads and parking lots and buildings and such. But this area historically was called North Springs because there was a spring here north of the Sandy Springs, and hence the name of the high school became North Springs for the spring that used to be here.
In our area, we have the neighborhood called Willow Springs, where Country Club Roswell is, right up off of Old Alabama Road, about 2 miles from here, because there used to be springs there. Now, we don't see the springs anymore because they were dammed up to make a couple little lakes. But if you were to swim to the bottom of the lakes there in the Willow Springs neighborhood, you could locate where water is still coming up out of the ground naturally, and you have springs. The town of Cave Springs in North Georgia.
So here I am in the town of Cave Spring, Georgia. As you can imagine, the town got its name because it is a place where there is a spring, water coming up naturally out of the ground, but it comes out of the ground inside of a cave, which makes it a little bit unique. Now the cave is back here. They've actually built a little fort around the cave to help protect it, because this is how the town got their drinking water, and they didn't want anybody to get into the source of their drinking water and pollute it. Any animals, any people, any pollution. You can still see behind me that pipe back there. That's where they take the spring water and they run it into every house in town. That's what they drink. That's what comes out of their faucet. Now they've left this right here, a place where the spring empties out of the cave, and you can come here and you can collect all the spring water you want. There's a container back there which I've collected for us to use in class. Every time I've been here, I've seen multiple people with large amounts of containers just collecting the spring water to take home and drink. Why not? It's free. As opposed to having to go to the grocery store and buy spring water, you can come here and you can get it for free. Some people like the taste of this particular spring water so much that they come from all over to collect it and bring it home. As a matter of fact, people collect so much spring water that right here outside the cave you can see there's a couple wheelbarrows and there's a hand truck that people can use to move the large amounts of water that they will collect here and take home. I just talked to a lady who was from Stone Mountain, Georgia, and we're about almost 2 hours away from Stone Mountain, Georgia here, and she had one of these wheelbarrows just full of these big, large 5-gallon water containers to take home to her house. She swears by this water, says there's nothing else that she would rather drink. So once again, this is Cave Spring, Georgia, where we have a cave that has a spring inside of it that is giving the town its spring water.
Now this here is Radium Springs, which is actually the largest spring in Georgia. It's down just south of the town of Albany in the middle of the South Georgia. Here you can actually see where the water looks like it's boiling up. That's where the water is coming up out of the surface. It's a pretty good sized spring. And what they did here in Radium Springs is that they built a resort around it. It was a place where people could come and swim, and they could take drinking water, and you can see how perfectly clear the water is. The fish look like they are suspended in air because the water is so clear.
So let's take a look at this bottle here. You'll notice it is labeled spring water. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the water that is in this bottle must have come out of the ground naturally from a spring, which is what a spring is. It's a place where water comes out of the ground naturally. If you sell what's called spring water, if you have spring water on the label, on the back you basically have to be able to prove that it came out of the ground naturally. You can see the ingredients say spring water. You can also see that down here it has a source listed. It says Silver Springs in Silver Springs, Florida. By law, if you sell spring water, you gotta say where it came from. You basically have to prove that it came out of the ground naturally.
Poland Spring is a popular brand of spring water, and they're actually being sued because it was alleged that they are not selling 100% true spring water, that they're cutting it with other sources of water that aren't from that particular spring. So what's this deal with purified water? What does it mean to be purified water as opposed to spring water? If you see this on the label, that means it's just water that's been cleaned and put into a bottle, which means it could come from anywhere. It could come from the tap that is in your sink. It could come from a river, a lake, a swamp. It could be groundwater, but not likely.
So let's examine Dasani and talk about what it means to be Dasani water. Now, Dasani is not labeled with spring water. It says purified water. Well, the fact that it doesn't say spring water on the label means Dasani was not sourced directly from the ground. It's not from a natural spring, otherwise it would be labeled as such. Well, we flip it over and we also see in the back there is no source listed. Because remember, if you call something spring water, you have to actually denote, you have to designate what natural spring it came out of. Dasani is not spring water, so therefore it doesn't have to have a source listed. So that begs the question, what is Dasani? Well, it is what's called purified water. Purified water is just H2O. They put purified on the label just to let you know that, hey, it's been cleaned, it's been treated, it's safe to drink, but where this water came from is unknown, and it could come from anywhere. It could come from a river, a lake, it could come from the ground, although unlikely. In the case of Dasani here in our area, it comes from the Chattahoochee River. It's the same water that runs through our taps here in Roswell. So the fact that it's purified water means there's really nothing special about it. Dasani in California can come from a water company in California. Dasani in New York comes from a water company in New York. It is not spring water. It does not come from the ground naturally.
So why are there so many different brands of spring water? You go to the grocery store and they're all over the place. Well, remember, there's a lot of different springs. There's tons of springs. So every part of the United States has their own spring from which they get their drinking water and put it in a bottle and sell it. People in California are going to buy their spring water from a spring out there, whereas in Georgia, we buy water from a spring that's closer to us. We're not going to buy spring water from California. Why would we? We got springs in our part of the country. It's easier to get it from a spring close by. Plus, you can't have just one brand of spring water because there's no one single spring that could give enough water to cover every bottle of spring water that was going to be sold. Most of you probably haven't ever seen this particular brand of spring water unless you've been out west, because if you'll notice the source, it says Riverside County, California. So this is a spring water that you would buy in a grocery store in California, but we don't sell it here in Georgia. It's even more unlikely that you ever heard of these two brands, because these are both from springs in Europe. They're not going to sell American spring water in Europe because they have their own spring water over there. So what's the deal with Fiji water? Fiji is spring water, but most of you know it's a lot more expensive than other brands of spring water. And that's because Fiji is an island in the Pacific, and they have a spring there. It gives out a lot of water, but we have to put that water on a ship, send it over here through the Panama Canal, and then put it on a truck and send it to us. So Fiji water is expensive because it comes from very far away, and there's a huge amount of cost associated with transporting it. So why would you pay all that extra money? Well, because some people like the particular taste of the Fiji water. This water comes all the way from Iceland, so it's going to be more expensive than spring water that is close to us, because Iceland is an island out in the middle of the North Atlantic. You go to the grocery store and look at these three spring waters. Fiji from an island, Iceland, this Volvic, this is from France, and notice their cost for about approximately the same size bottles. Now, we get a huge bottle of Deer Park water for about less than half the cost. Why? Because Deer Park water comes from a spring in Florida, which is right next door to us. So the cost of spring water is primarily dependent upon how far away does it come from. Now, they all do have different taste because they're coming out of the ground that is different in one location versus another. And there are minerals in spring water, so that when the water comes up out of the ground, they can have different minerals in it and hence give you a different taste. All spring waters have to have on the back or be able to provide you a list of the minerals that are in the water. And it's the different combination of minerals that give different spring waters their taste. These two spring waters, the same company, but I noticed this is in Publix in our area. they come from two different sources. It's the same companies, proud source spring water, but one's from the Rocky Mountains, one's from the Apalachicola down in Florida. And you flip the label over and you'll notice they have a little bit different mineral content. That's 4.2 for calcium, and this one's 5.1. The magnesium here is 6.8. The magnesium here is 1.6. Because they're coming out of the ground in different locations, different ground, they're going to have different minerals, but it's going to give them a different taste. And you can taste the difference. So you maybe want one brand of spring water versus another. Now, a mineral spring is entirely different. A mineral spring is a place where there's so much minerals in there, it really affects the taste and or behavior of the water. Here's some definitions. We need these in our notes. A mineral spring where the water has enough minerals so that it alters the taste significantly. And mineral water tastes different because it's got so many minerals in it. Here's an example of a mineral spring. Now this doesn't look very clear. It looks very murky, and it is because it has so many minerals. The minerals in this, a lot of iron. As a matter of fact, this brown stuff that you see over here is rust. This water has so much iron in it that when it comes out of the ground and starts to run off, it drops the iron behind, and iron will rust outside, especially in the presence of water. So nobody's going to drink this mineral water because it would taste like drinking a rusty nail, but it gives you a good example of what a mineral spring is like. It's one that has so many minerals in it. You can see it, taste it, sometimes even smell it. Here's Lithium Spring in Colorado, and this one actually had a lot of the mineral lithium in it, which has some curative properties. Lithium is an atom, is a mineral that has some health benefits to it. So people would drink this water, and you can see it's very cloudy because there's so many minerals in there. It gives it a murky appearance. They bottled this water and sold it all across the country at one point as kind of like an elixir, kind of a healing potion. Soda Springs, an area in Idaho, had naturally carbonated water because the minerals that were coming out of the ground with the water would expand and turn to a gas. So you actually had bubbly water coming out of the ground. Here's another example. People would come here and they would get like a natural soda water. Think about the bubbly mineral water that you buy. Here's a place where it comes out of the ground naturally. Same thing here. Here's another natural mineral spring called Hooper Spring, once again in Idaho, where it has a lot of different minerals in it that were thought to have curative or healthy benefits. This is one of the soda springs, and this looks like somebody opened a can of soda and it's bubbling out the top because there's so many minerals in there, there's so many bicarbonate in there that gives this water a natural fizziness. Here's Sulphur Spring in Oklahoma. You can imagine this thing has a lot of sulfur in it, gives the water a kind of a rotten egg smell and or taste. Probably not the best water to drink. It just wouldn't be very pleasant, but you can see all the range of minerals that it has in it. My son did not particularly care for the smell and or taste when we were there this spring. Close by, there was a sign in one of the bathrooms about why was the bathroom stinky. Well, it's because they have well water. Or they drill down there and they get that groundwater that has a lot of minerals in it, including sulfur, which gave it a very distinct smell. Now, are mineral springs good for you? In the old days, in the 1800s, even in the 1900s, mineral waters were put out there as having magical properties to help cure you and heal ailments. And there's a certain truth to that, because in the old days, before people took vitamins, they didn't have very well balanced diets. They couldn't eat their fruits and vegetables year round. You would have vitamin and mineral deficiencies, which could lead to health problems. So in certain cases, if you drank the mineral water, it would be like taking a daily vitamin. So there were places that sprung up where hospitals and rehabilitation facilities would pop up and say, hey, come drink our healthy water and you will end up feeling better. And there's some truth to that. Manitou Springs in Colorado was very famously a place where people came to take in the waters because they have very, very distinctly high mineral content waters there. And the person who first set up this town recognized, hey, I've got all these springs here and they have all kinds of different tastes and minerals. This could be healthy to people. And he actually set aside the springs for public use. And you can go there today and there's these public springs all over town. You can just walk up and you can get all the spring water you want. And it is very definitely mineral water. Each one has a very unique mineral content. Some of them are very, very strong in terms of their mineral content. And they were considered to be healing waters because, once again, it was like taking a vitamin where you didn't have a very well-balanced diet.
So here's a sample of the water that I brought back from Manitou Springs in Colorado this summer. The water's been sitting now a couple months in this container, and now you can see at the bottom there appears to be little crystals of stuff down there. And what those are minerals that were in the water that have now settled to the bottom because the water isn't moving as much as when it came out of the spring. So this is an example of how you can see the minerals that are in the spring water.
If you pick up some samples of water in the grocery store, they'll actually be labeled mineral water. And that's a type of spring water that has so many minerals in it that it has a very distinctly different taste to it. So that's the difference between regular, what they say, mineral water and just spring water. So that's the end of the presentation. This time you need to turn in your list of questions with your 5 additional facts, trivia, thoughts, comments, or questions in order to receive credit for today's assignment.